Good afternoon and hello to everyone joining this session of FAT Talks. My name is Farah and I'm your moderator for today. Today we are absolutely honored to have this speaker join us today, and we are just as excited as all of you for this opportunity. Before we begin, I would like to share some house rules. Please have your mics and videos turned off throughout this session. Also, please mind your language in the chat box. No inappropriate content is allowed. Now, I'll pass the stage to Dr. Andy to introduce our speaker today. All yours, Dr. Andy.
Thank you, Farah, for that introduction, and thank you everybody for attending our new semester edition of our FAT Talks. FAT Talks, FAT stands for Future Action Thought. It's all about the Faculty of Arts and Communication and Help University bringing you innovative, creative, and internationally recognized speakers who are going to talk to you on a range of subjects. It gives me great pleasure, and it is an honor today to introduce to you and welcome Professor Jomo Kwame. He is internationally recognized. He has so much experience in working with local governments, international governments, the United Nations. He's worked with Ban Ki-moon, with Father Miguel de Escoto, if I've pronounced his name right. He's senior advisor to the Kasna Research Institute and visiting fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue in Columbia University. The list goes on. In fact, I could spend the whole of the session listing out his achievements and some of the amazing work that he's done. But I'm going to leave that up to him. So with a very brief introduction, Prof Jomo, I would like to welcome you to the stage and look forward to listening to what you have to offer to our audience. And then also we will have a discussion after your presentation. So over to you, Professor Jomo. Thank you.
Prof Jomo, could you please unmute your mic, please? It should be at the button at the top right.
Right. Well, once again, thank you very much to the moderator, Dr. Andy, and also to Help University for kindly inviting me to talk to you this afternoon. What I'm going to speak about may seem very familiar, namely how dealing with COVID-19. I think what is challenging is to recognize both the novelty of the phenomenon of COVID-19 and also to recognize what is, in a sense, enduring, in the sense that we have had a series of epidemics affecting this part of the world. Those of you who are older in the audience will remember avian flu, MERS, Nipah virus, etc. And this part of the world, Southeast Asia in particular, but also East Asia more generally, has been unfortunately host to a number of new viruses and as a consequence, recent epidemics. Some of them have been more dangerous in the sense that the risk of fatalities, the risk of mortality is much higher. Some of them have been more dangerous in the sense that the rate of infection or contagion is very high, but the proportion of fatalities is lower. In any case, we need to begin to understand these phenomena together. As is now well known, the novelty of this virus, and it was given the original name novel coronavirus, was first recognized at the end of last year, 2019, in China after an outbreak in Wuhan city. For those not familiar, Wuhan city is the industrial hub of China and has been so for at least a century. And so Wuhan has been home to a great deal of manufacturing activity over this period. Wuhan was the source of this outbreak, at least as currently recognized. And there is also some evidence to suggest that there are perhaps 3 different strains of SARS-CoV-2 virus. Okay, the virus, the name of the virus is different from the name of the epidemic. So we often talk about COVID-19 as the name of the epidemic and SARS-CoV-2 as the name of the virus. This virus is, as its name implies, causes severe acute respiratory problems. And because it was not the first one, SARS happened around 2002, 2003. This was a different virus, and hence CoV-2. It is a coronavirus. Viruses come in different forms and shapes. When I was a student many years ago, one couldn't even see viruses through microscopes. Today, the SARS-CoV-2 is recognized as a virus with a corona shape. But because it was new, it was called the novel coronavirus initially. The outbreak happened probably in the last quarter, but perhaps even earlier, in and around Wuhan, and reached epidemic proportions in Wuhan, and before it was recognized as being different. It was recognized as a pneumonic, meaning that it affects particularly the pneumonic system, of the human body, particularly respiratory organs, and it is spread by aerosol. In other words, it is born in the air, but because of the weight of the aerosol droplets, it doesn't travel all that far. Hence the recommendation of maintaining a 2-meter distance between people to avoid contagion or to minimize the risk of contagion. Now, all this was fairly quickly recognized, and part of the reason East Asia has done relatively well coping with SARS is precisely because of the earlier infections, earlier epidemics which affected this part of the world. And initially, the epidemic was expected to be confined to certain parts of the world. It was not expected to spread to the rest of the world. But governments which were vigilant were very, very conscious of this. So you have, for example, the government of Vietnam, which incredibly has not seen a single death yet from COVID-19, or the government of Kerala, a southwestern state in India, where the Malayali people come from, Malayalam-speaking people come from. Those two governments were very, very effective in taking very early precautionary and preventive measures and ensuring that the infections which had affected them recognized as early as January, were quickly contained and did not spread beyond. But unfortunately, much of the rest of the world did not take adequate precautionary and preventive measures. It became necessary to deal with the epidemic as it spread, by undertaking various types of measures, including what are called stay-in-shelter lockdown measures. In other words, requiring people to stay where they are, in shelter, of course, but not to move, not to go to work, not to socialize, not to go to public places, and so on and so forth. This was seen as necessary to deal with contagion, to try to limit contagion, and so on. These are some of the. This is very important for us to recognize, because in many parts of the world, including our own part of the world, we tend to look west for lessons and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, the Anglophone world in the West, both the UK and the US, did not cope as well with COVID-19 compared to East Asian countries. There have been relatively few infections in, for example, Japan, Taiwan province of China, the Republic of Korea or South Korea, and even in China, the lockdown measures were limited to Wuhan city and the 3 provinces surrounding Wuhan city. In the rest of China, precautionary measures were taken. There was a great deal of testing, but there was no stay-in-shelter lockdowns as in much of the rest of the world, including Malaysia. So it's very important for us to recognize the importance of public policy measures in dealing with contemporary public health problems, that these problems are not going to go away just because we wish them to go away, but there is a need for action. So what has happened and what has been extremely important in different parts of the world are what we call all of government approaches. In other words, involving all the different machinery of government, involving all of society or the whole of society. So all of government, whole of the approaches have been really important. And this is important for us to recognize because the success or otherwise of measures is really requires not only a comprehensive governmental approach, but also extensive, in fact, comprehensive social cooperation. If you have antisocial behavior, as we have seen in a number of cases, the infamous Sivaganga case, and the Datins going around doing their business, even though they were supposed to be in quarantine, you can have so-called super spreader episodes, which basically can undo all the good which has been done. It is also very important to recognize that because we have not been able to get rid of the virus doesn't simply go away on its own, despite many expectations to the contrary. We have seen the resurgences. We have seen second outbreaks or second waves in different parts of the world. This happened, for example, in Beijing in China. It happened in Singapore, despite the measures undertaken in Singapore. And there are fears that a second wave will affect many other parts of the world as well. So it is important for us to be extremely vigilant about these measures. It's also important to recognize that there have been a great number of expectations about a vaccine. But unfortunately, law today, the international laws affecting intellectual property, so-called intellectual property, patents and so on and so forth, allow countries more importantly, allow companies to control the so-called intellectual property rights, exclusive rights, and disallow others from using those such knowledge. Now, it's very important to recognize that all this is very new. It's not existed throughout society. For example, I'm not sure about what you are all inoculated or vaccinated against, but I have had at least 3 or 4 major vaccinations in my own life. As a young child, I was vaccinated against tuberculosis with a vaccine which is more than a century old, the BCG vaccine. I was also vaccinated against smallpox, and I was also vaccinated against polio. And Jonas Salk, the famous man who discovered the polio vaccine, famously said that to have a patent on the polio vaccine is like trying to claim a patent to the sun. The sun belongs to all. It does not belong to any individual. But unfortunately, we have seen a strengthening of intellectual property rights, particularly in recent decades. And there have been various attempts to extend the scope of intellectual property rights in order for companies to make more money. So the consequence of this is that companies are constantly looking at how they can make more money. They are very happy to receive grants from governments and from other sources such as large philanthropic organizations to develop new vaccines, but they jealously protect their right to use the patents exclusively. And so the result is that even having a COVID-19 vaccine does not ensure that it will be accessible to all. Already we know that the US government has explicitly made clear that the COVID-19 vaccine should come under the control of the United States, and it will determine who has access to the vaccine and so on and so forth. This, of course, has been challenged by others, most notably by Europeans, who also have been trying to put in orders, pre-orders, if you will, for vaccines. So there is a multi-billion-dollar business going on, scramble for vaccines involving billions and billions of dollars. For the rest of the world, for developing countries in particular who cannot afford these very, very expensive vaccines, the situation is much, much more difficult. Of course, individuals might be able to afford these vaccines regardless of the price, but as a society, it is very unlikely that we can afford it. Just to give you an example of how what differences in prices may be, some of you may have a relative who has hepatitis C. Hepatitis C is quite endemic in Malaysia. Malaysia has a population of about 33 million people right now, and there are estimated to be about 500,000 people with hepatitis C. And the treatment for hepatitis C the currently available best treatment for hepatitis C takes about 12 weeks, and the treatment from the American company costs close to $70,000 US for a 12-week treatment, and that is almost a 300,000 ringgit. Now, 500,000 people cannot afford the 300,000 treatment each. Thankfully, there are generic producers who have been able to produce and market their own versions of the treatment. And the Malaysian Ministry of Health has bought a treatment for hepatitis C from an Egyptian company, and that costs $130 US. In other words, somewhere in the region of $1,200 to $300 US, not 130, $300 US, and that costs something in the region of 1,300 ringgit. Okay, so the numbers, the contrast, 1,300 ringgit per treatment versus almost 300,000 ringgit per treatment is a huge difference, and you can imagine what the consequences are. So we begin to see how many different aspects of life, virology, public health, law, and business, all of them come together in a way which almost conspire against solving many contemporary public health problems. So coming back to COVID-19, we have a very, very difficult situation. Many people have been waiting and hoping that vaccine would solve all problems. Now it is becoming increasingly clear that besides the question of the cost of the vaccine, the efficacy of a vaccine is also in doubt. There are, for example, partly due to prejudice, a lot of doubts about the Russian vaccine. And recently, yesterday I think it was, there was a report that the so-called Oxford vaccine, they have stopped tests because of some problems with some of the patients who have been part of the trials for the Oxford vaccine. But there are over 100 different trials in different vaccine development projects in different parts of the world. Many of them have reached the trial stage. The Chinese, for example, one of the vaccines seems to be quite promising so far, and there are, of course, many other efforts, but it will take some time. President Trump, in his re-election effort, has announced a project called Warp Speed, and very cleverly he has promised that the vaccine will only be available at the beginning of next year. In other words, re-elect him and you will get the vaccine. So we can see how this also affects politics and so on and so forth. And many governments in the world have done very well because they have had some degree of success in dealing with COVID-19. For example, if we look at the approval ratings according to the Merdeka Center for Prime Minister Mahyudin Yassin, they are well in excess of 80% for him personally because of his handling of COVID-19. In Singapore, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong called for an early election precisely because he felt that his record in dealing with COVID-19 would be appreciated by the Singapore public. And most people acknowledge that they did, the ruling PAP did better than they otherwise would have thanks to COVID-19. So we can see that, regardless of your intellectual interest, your academic interest, and so on and so forth, COVID-19 poses challenges for all of us in different spheres of our lives. One of the very interesting recent developments, which I'm very interested in, is the development of a test for saliva, for sputum, which has been developed by different people. The Yale University test is particularly interesting. It is relatively simple. It promises to be fast, cheap, and also very fast, cheap, and with results available almost immediately. Okay, so this will make a huge difference. It'll make it possible, for example, for people to travel more easily, to move between places more easily, because people can quickly be tested. The problems currently with testing are that you need the antigens or the antibodies to develop. And so if you take the antigen test, it takes a certain number of days before you get the results. If you take the antibody test, it takes an even longer period before the antibodies appear. So it is extremely important to have a test of the saliva, for instance, where you can find, because the virus survives best in human mucus, whether the mucus of the eyes, or the mucus of the nose, or the mucus of the mouth. So you have 3 different types of mucus, and you can test from any of them. Saliva, of course, is the easiest to quick samples of. So the testing basically will be a very important step forward, but it basically means that we will continue to have to live with COVID-19. And so in different spheres of life, in the economy, in higher education, which you're all involved with, and in many other spheres of life, we will need to make very, very early adjustments if we are going to survive. And this is extremely important, not only at the level of the individual enterprise, the individual activity, the individual workplace, and so on and so forth. It will also be extremely important in terms of how the economy recovers. Many small businesses, especially, have been very, very adversely affected, and it is going to be extremely difficult for us to return to a level of economic activity as existed before COVID-19. So this poses very, very special challenges for all of us, and I do hope that you will apply your minds to begin to think about how these different problems may be better addressed by our collective efforts, not only in terms of our social altruistic behavior, in terms of how we live our lives and how we are considerate towards our fellow human beings, but also very, very importantly, it will be important for us to begin to think that perhaps we are going to have to live differently in the future. In other words, all this talk about what is called a new normal may well be premature, that in a sense, there will be no new normal. Life will continue to evolve and change fairly rapidly as we discover new ways and means by which we cope with the challenges which we have ahead. This makes it all the more challenging for us as we carry on with our lives, as we carry on with our studies, and as we deal with our in our social relations with our loved ones, with our fellow students, with our teachers, and with others. This promises to be a very exciting new world in which we are going to be living in. And I think with those preliminary remarks, I think I hope I've opened up enough issues which may be of interest to you, which we can engage in for the remainder of the time we have together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Prof Jomo, for some very insightful comments, your presentation. You've covered many issues, and I'm sure we're going to get some questions coming in from our audience. Please write them in the chat box if you do have any questions. I'd like to start off, if I may. Most of your talk, a lot of the talk, has been about us living with COVID. And it's not that it's going to be a new normal, it's that we're going to need to find a new way of living. And I think that includes not only individuals, but society in general, governments, companies. So we're all going to need to find a way to live with COVID. Initially, on an individual basis, we have, over these past months, well, since the beginning of the year, been given a lot of sometimes conflicting advice on how we should protect ourselves and protect others from COVID. Particularly in the UK, I can say there's been an awful lot of conflicts. I think in Malaysia, certainly from my experience of what has been said in the UK and Malaysia, that Malaysia has been more on point and more consistent with its messages. Wearing a mask, social distancing, and so on. So apart from washing your hands, I mean, those are the three main key things that we're told. So I think the first question is, what do you think, apart from those three key things, that we as individuals can do to not only protect ourselves, but also to protect other people?
Well, thank you very much. I think those are very important questions to raise. I think one of the big problems we have right now is the power of social media. So many of us rely and get a great deal of our information and our knowledge or supposed knowledge from the social media. Now, very often the social media does convey information which is accurate, reliable, but the tendency is for the sensationalists, for the extraordinary, and so on to spread much more easily. And there is a tendency for the novel, if you will, to be promoted. And so we have, for example, people making slightly outrageous statements. The most outrageous statements, of course, nobody takes very seriously. But if you have a slightly outrageous statement, something which perks people's attention, there's a tendency for such items to go around very much more readily. So, for instance, I was watching a video yesterday which turned out to be quite bogus, but by somebody who was using a great deal of scientific terms to basically suggest that you do not get enough oxygen if you use masks, and that will affect your ability to think. It will affect your ability to function, and it will warp your ability to respond. Now, it turns out to be completely erroneous. I have actually checked on this with some of my friends who work in this area on a professional basis, and there is no basis for this claim. In fact, there are many other advantages of wearing a mask, as is now well known, besides protecting ourselves from COVID-19. In fact, as you know, in societies like Japan and China, many people who suspect they have an infection of some other kind go around wearing masks. And the promotion of the use of masks actually was initiated by a Malaysian over a century ago. A man named Dr. Wu Lian Te, who had trained as a doctor, first in Cambridge and then in London, and then later visited laboratories in Europe, in Germany and France. Dr. Wu Lian Te came back to Malaysia, and he organized an anti-opium campaign. And in doing so, he incurred the wrath of the colonial authorities in Penang, and he was basically set up for sort of a trumped-up charge of having a possession of opium. And in those days, as you know, opium was widely used as an anesthetic, and so he was arrested, and basically his career in the Strait settlements was gone. So he went and was looking for work elsewhere and volunteered, and ended up dealing with not a bubonic plague, but a pneumonic plague in Manchuria, where he came into conflict with a French doctor who insisted that mask wearing was completely unnecessary because it was a bubonic plague, which was spread by animals, and rather than a pneumonic plague. And unfortunately, the French doctor died 4 weeks later. So the measure prevailed. Later on, when there were a lot of Russians as well as Japanese living in Manchuria in those days, and when the Japanese invaded Manchuria before invading the rest of China, they saw this practice, and they began to adopt and promote the practice in Japan itself. So the history of mask wearing in East Asia has a very complicated political history, if you will. But I think it's very important to recognize that the use of masks has been very, very extensive. In Kerala, for example, the people are very, very poor, and what they have done instead is basically to take an old sari, a rag, and fold it in two, and basically wear it across the face. You know, like you know, in the old cowboy films of a bandit. You know, so you basically have two layers of cotton, which is actually the ideal thing to do, because cotton is actually the virus only survives for about 15 minutes on cotton surfaces, and if you wash the cloth often enough, this has been extremely effective. This is very important, but I think it is very important for people to begin to understand and to explain to their friends, their loved ones, and others what the problem is. And it is important to get reliable information, which is difficult in these times, because very often official information is kind of boring or difficult to understand, and it is important to understand. That's why I emphasize that we need a whole of an all of government approach, which is more than just the public health system or the home affairs, policing of the population. What you really need is a great deal of understanding all around as to how as to the risk factors involved, not only in this matter but also in other matters. So now you have a lot of activity, which is in turn causing some new problems. For example, there is a great deal of use of plastic, and we already have a great deal of plastic. The earlier governments of Malaysia allowed the importation of plastic waste from countries like Japan and Australia. Of public waste, more than 80% of that public waste is not processed; it's just thrown into landfills. And so this plastic waste is going to be hugely problematic for generations to come. We have already seen recently with the water problem in Selangor, a great deal of there has been renewed attention to the problems of waste. We also know that with global warming, for example, a whole season, rice planting season in Kedah was cancelled. So we really need a far greater level of public awareness and public consciousness. In the old days, in the late 20th century, most people got their information from public television, public radio, newspapers, and so on and so forth. The rise of the social media, particularly the digital social media, makes all kinds of information equally legitimate almost. And this is hugely problematic, and we need to begin to think about how, without being overly sensorial, how we begin to deal with new sources of information. So these are some of the challenges which we face. So beginning to educate people at large about the challenges of COVID-19 will be important, not only for COVID-19, but for a whole range of other social problems which we are dealing with today, including the problems of global warming, including the problems of environmental destruction and pollution, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Farah, I see you have your hand up, and I'll come to you in a second. Thank you for that very detailed answer, Prof JOMO. Linked a little bit to this, particularly in relation to social media and where people get their information from. I've noticed strangers and a lot of what I would even regard as intelligent friends of mine in varying levels denying COVID-19, or at least how bad it is. And often it's in relation to things like, well, it's, if you look at the deaths of COVID around the world and you compare them to cancer and to AIDS and to other things, it's insignificant. And some would say that so much resources have gone into COVID-19 that people are now not having the cancer treatments and so on, and other difficult diseases that they were before. What would you say to such people, the COVID deniers, so to speak?
Well, I think there are several types of COVID deniers. Okay, I think even in your preamble, there are those who do not recognize the threat, and there are a variety of them. There are those, for example, who believe that God will take care of us, for instance, and so on and so forth. And then there are those who actually see this as end of days, and something to be sort of resigned to, in a sense. Then there are people like the Prime Minister of Britain. Before the middle of March, the official attitude in Britain, similar to the current Swedish government, was to develop a so-called herd immunity. In other words, to allow the virus to spread, allow the epidemic to spread, and then with the epidemic spreading enough that the whole community would have enough immunity, natural immunity. Now, some people have qualified this by saying we will allow the community to the virus to spread to everybody, except perhaps the older people who are more vulnerable, or those with respiratory problems who are more vulnerable. So there are a variety of such views, and these views are unfortunately still quite influential. In fact, I think President Trump, one of President Trump's new advisors on COVID-19, has revived this idea of herd immunity. Now, my simple response would be to say two things. That if you are as as religious as you claim to be, surely you would agree that it is not God's will to destroy all of humanity with COVID-19, and therefore it would your responsibility would be to be socially to behave socially responsibly. But even that, for example, becomes hugely problematic. There was a great deal of propaganda for over half a year on how irrelevant masks were. This was seen as something which was peculiarly Asian. And there were even incidents of violence against people wearing masks, especially Asians wearing masks. I have a Japanese American friend who's a professor at MIT, who was actually assaulted in a Boston subway. I have friends in Australia, in Melbourne, who had nieces assaulted on the road. For walking around wearing masks. So it's not a trivial matter, but I think it is also very important to recognize that masks offer a fairly high degree of protection, but not absolute protection. And so it is important to maintain a certain degree of physical distancing. And that's why from the outset, I have opposed the idea of social distancing and emphasize the idea of physical distancing. So what physical distancing basically implies is a maintenance of a certain degree of distance, physical distance, but it does not mean social disconnection. And social disconnection is actually disastrous in the present conditions. It's very important to maintain those social relations. You cannot visit your grandparents, perhaps, but it's important for them not to feel isolated, because one of the unfortunate conditions of physical distancing, if it also involves social distancing, is a sense of isolation, a sense of enemy sets in, and so on. So it's very important to begin to recognize that responsible social behavior involves not only those things which you have emphasized. There is a longer checklist, for example, which the Japanese authorities have recently come out with, over a dozen things people should be doing, and so on and so forth. But everybody has their own list. I think the efficacy of these lists of each measure of these lists has to be determined and actively promoted in a positive way, to begin to help people to understand why they're doing what they're being asked to do, rather than simply requiring them to do so and policing them without them understanding how it helps. So, for example, just washing your hands under running water, it's just not good enough, unfortunately. You can sing happy birthday 10 times, but running water alone was not going to do the trick. It is the lather in the soap which basically breaks down the lipid barrier around the virus which is so important. So having that, not necessarily through expensive soaps, and likewise the alcohol to be found in many sanitizers performs a similar function. So helping people to understand why they're doing what they're doing is extremely important. And this is where those of you involved in media communications, it becomes extremely important, and finding new ways and means by which to connect socially becomes extremely important.
Thank you. It's the first time I've heard somebody mention eyes. You touched on it earlier in your presentation. As well as being a respiratory condition, you also talked about mucus, bodily fluids, and so on as a possible source of infection. So while we wear masks to cover our faces, in that case, should we not be wearing some kind of masks for our eyes?
Well, it has been recommended, and in many countries, for example, in China, children who are going back to school are wearing shields, a shield which covers the entire face. I think it is very important to recognize that it is those three orifices which matter. The other bodily fluids, sweat, and so on, does not matter as far as COVID-19 is concerned. So ensuring that the mucous membranes of those three orifices are well.
The eyes, the nose, the mouth.
Sorry.
The eyes, the nose, the mouth.
Exactly. In reverse order, actually. Of the nose and the eyes are probably, because people like you, for example, who wear glasses have a certain degree of protection, because you of course aerosol substances can get around your eyeglasses, but we are, if you think about the normal trajectory of an aerosol substance, but it's also very important for us to recognize that the eyes are very unlikely, are less likely to emit as well as to receive compared to the other two orifices, because we normally breathe through our nose unless you're swimming and you breathe through your mouth, and so the other two orifices are far more important and generally recognized as such.
Okay, thank you. So getting back to the respiratory system, and one of the things that you mentioned is those that have existing respiratory conditions could be more at risk of getting COVID-19. Could the same be said that those that have good respiratory systems, like runners or sports people, be less at risk? And if you don't undertake sport, could that be one thing that could help prevent your risk of contracting it?
I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think I would presume that anybody who's reasonably athletic and does not smoke or vape in between is probably in a better condition, in a sense that you do not have a pre-existing problem in your pulmonary system, which would exacerbate or worsen your vulnerability. But I think one would need to have much more a clear medical advice about, and I have not read the studies on this matter. So let me stop there.
Okay. Can I just remind people, if you do want to ask a question, please either write it in the chat box or raise your hand. Okay, getting back to Farah, did you have a question or something you wanted to say?
Yes. So, Prof Jomo, I actually really like the word that you use for how people respond to things on social media nowadays, which is over sensorial. And I think that's completely true because it's so unfortunate to see some friends or even family members that sort of spread information with no scientific proof or any research behind it. And it's really quite frustrating. So I want to state that how the social media or even internet back in the early 2000s are completely different, right, compared to nowadays. So I wanted to ask, how would you compare how Malaysia has faced SARS in 2003 and SARS-CoV-2 now? Like, are the things that we respond, sorry, is the way that we respond to the virus now better than 2003, or is it worse, unexpected?
Okay, I do not. I was away for part of that time, so I cannot remember all the details of it. But I think at the global level, it's important to remember that SARS was less infectious. Okay, it did not spread so easily. SARS was probably more dangerous in the sense that there were less. It didn't.
There are more fatalities, yeah.
No, because it involved respiratory systems and did not require an aerosol substance. So the thing about SARS-CoV-2 is that it can be carried by droplets, aerosol droplets. Okay,
Yeah.
and aerosol droplets, of course, you can under certain conditions speak so loudly and speak with such great passion that your saliva and whatnot travels quite extensively. And, if I'm on a stage and I'm one such person and you are below, I might reach as far as 4 meters, so on and so forth. But, those are very extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah.
So the general recommendation is 2 meters. Some people say 1 meter. I tend to be on the safe side and I stick with the 2 meters. And it's very interesting how even very poor societies, if you look at some of the photographs of people going to the market in Kerala, for example, the vendor and the customer are standing at least 2 meters apart until the point of exchange. And in many societies now, in China, for example, you don't even hand over money. Everything, even beggars beg with your, what do you call it? What is that? I'm sorry.
Apple Pay or something.
I'm sorry?
Apple Pay or something.
Yeah. They don't use Apple Pay, but WeChat or whatever it is, right?
Oh.
So it has that squarish
QR code.
What code?
A QR code, is that?
Yes, right. So, sorry.
I see.
Okay.
It's okay.
So you have so you even have beggars having their QR codes. I remember in Beijing about a year and a half ago, going out and buying this what we call lok. You sort of take dip it in water, in hot boiling water for a few minutes, and then I had spent the equivalent of about 20 cents. No, sorry, it was about maybe about 80 cents. And
Still cheap.
they would take money. They wanted me to use a QR code, and of course I did. I wasn't equipped, and so on and so forth. So eventually, very reluctantly, they took money, and I had to do it through an intermediary. I had to pay somebody who would take the money and then put it on their own bank account. So you have, and this is happening in a society which is poorer than Malaysia, okay? And nobody was subsidized, everybody was using it, and so on and so forth. So you can actually have a high degree of usage of this. I mean, right now, for example, when I try to go into a building where they have so-called security.
Yes.
And the amount of plastic I have to exchange with the security guards and so on and so forth, it's really worrying, because the security guard probably deals with a few hundred people every day, and is the ideal transmitter, and just wearing a piece of plastic is not very good, because the virus survives on plastic for about 3 to 4 days, and the virus virus survives on metal surfaces for about 3 days. So actually using cotton would be much better, but even cotton is not, we would survive for about 15 minutes or so. So we are laboring under a lot of misconceptions, and the increased use of plastic is actually we are deluding ourselves by using so much plastic. But people are eating out much more, cooking out much more, and so on and so forth, or ordering in much more. And the use of plastic, something has to be done about all this. And you asked Farah about what was done in the old days. In the old days, we wrapped it up in banana leaves and paper. Used newspapers. We were recycling everything. But it would be kind of unthinkable. You go to an Indian restaurant today and you order banana leaf rice and you get a plastic banana leaf.
Yes, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
It's just not the same.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree. All right. I have one more question, by the way. You mentioned about mucus testing just now, right? How it's more effective when it comes to sampling. But I know it's effective, but do you think Malaysia will be willing to accept such a invasive way of testing? Because I mean, that is pretty invasive. I've seen it on TV for Australia, if I'm not mistaken. So, what do you think Malaysia would react?
Okay, the new test which Yale has developed, and the Israelis, and there's an Israeli company which claims to have developed something, and a few other companies which are also making such claims. And I'm not in a position to verify or prove or disprove any of these claims. What is important about them is that they're testing directly for the virus. Whereas in the existing tests, or the tests which are widely used all over the world, you're testing for antigens and antibodies. So the virus stimulates the emergence of the antibody or the antigen. Well, both are eventually stimulated, but the latter takes a longer time to emerge. And so you are waiting, so there's an incubation period. We are waiting for between infection and the emergence of the antigen and the antibody. You are basically infectious. As soon as you're infected, you are infectious. But we are not able to confirm that you have been infected. Okay, so that's why there is a delay in terms of testing. The new tests which are being suggested involve saliva, spitting into something. It's like doing a litmus test on a saliva sample.
Yeah.
It's much preferable to having a piece of like a cotton bud stuck up your nose or stuck into the back of your throat. So take your pick.
I suppose.
Yeah, but the other part of the thing which is so important is that it's cheap. It's very, very cheap, because the Yale group has just put out the information. They are not charging anybody. So anybody in the world can theoretically go ahead and do the test yourself. So India has a very large generic medicines industry. Bangladesh has been very, very impressive in terms of the generic medicines they produce. Those two countries, I've already contacted some friends to ask them to look at the effectiveness of this test. Some people in the field feel that the Yale test is a little less sophisticated, but so the question is how effective it is. If it's 100% effective in terms of picking up anybody with the virus, it is preferable to something which is, which only picks up 95% or even 98 or 99%. So there are pros and cons, which are better discussed by the experts. But I think what is important for us is the recognition of a very cheap, fast, and you get results immediately. You don't have to go and be quarantined in your hotel room for a few days while waiting for the results.
All right. Thank you, Prof JOMO. Dr. Andy, you may take the stage back.
Thank you, Farah. Thank you for answering those, Prof JOMO. I just want to move slightly away from individuals and more to sort of companies and possibly governments. You touched on your talk about big pharma, although you didn't use that phrase, the development of vaccines, particularly in the Oxford one that's had some problems with, I think, one person at least getting quite sick, with Russia that apparently are already rolling out a vaccine, and China as well, I heard this morning, are rolling out a vaccine to sort of medical staff, frontliners, so to speak. But in relation to vaccines, the one thing that you mentioned particularly, I see as a huge problem, is this protectionism and this profiteering, if you like, profiteering on people's health. What can we do about that? What can we do about getting these big pharmaceutical companies to try and put the population of the world before their profits? The protection of the population of the world before their profits. Is there anything that we can do about that?
It's too soon to tell, but there are things which need to be done. I mean, the problem you refer to is a huge problem. When those who support the existing system claim that it's absolutely essential in order to incentivize research, in order to the development of new medical products and so on and so forth. And the critics have come up with very, very persuasive evidence, in my view, that the system has actually failed to do so. I don't know whether you are aware with the term, there are so-called gateway patents. There's a practice called trolling, okay, of trolling, where people, the companies basically buy up every conceivable patent in a particular area in order to block further development. And by being able to block further development, any access through that requires that patent which they have at the gateway. So they might buy up, say, 2,000 patents, and only one actually has that gateway function. But that one patent is enough for them to make a killing. And certainly it's a killing in more ways than one. So this is what is happening right now with the world of patents and so on and so forth. And Professor Stiglitz and many others have actually done studies. James Love, Dean Baker, and others have done studies which basically conclusively show, in my view, that actually these patents, the existing patent system has actually been counterproductive. Patents and copyright and a whole range of other related intellectual property have actually been extended in recent times. And Malaysia, for example, is considering being a signatory to something called the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was basically being promoted first by President Obama. Now, the CPTPP basically would extend the range of patentable products to include so-called biologics. In other words, a naturally occurring substance would also be subjected to a patent. So for instance, right now, insulin is extracted from animals and used by humans with diabetes, type 1 or type 2 diabetes. Now, this would basically, the ability to patent something which is naturally occurring would actually raise that. Just imagine right now, penicillins and antibiotics are relatively cheaply available, but you would be able to charge much more for things which occur naturally, because as you know, I mean, the very famous story about how penicillin was developed. Alexander Fleming discovers this fungus growing on his dish, and then tests and then develops the. Now, so this is a huge problem. Now, people like President Mandela opposed this, and so the big pharma, as you put it, was forced to concede and make a concession in the form of the so-called public health exception. But it has been extremely difficult for most countries to exercise the public health exception. Just to give you an example, the older ones among you might remember that about 15 years ago or so, there was something called avian flu. And many countries wanted to develop something to use the patent for Tamiflu under this public health exception. But none of them were able to do so except one. And the one country which actually used this is the country which actually opposed the legislation, namely the United States. And there was a former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who got the rights to manufacture the Tamiflu, generic version of Tamiflu. So the United States actually had 300 million doses of Tamiflu available to deal with the avian flu, except that no birds could fly to the American continent from either Europe or from Asia. So there was no threat of avian flu in that continent. The threat of avian flu was rare in this part of the world, for instance. It was not available. So people had to use the more expensive Tamiflu and so on and so forth. So it is a very perverse system, but there are no easy ways out except to reverse the current trend and to undermine the very system of intellectual property rights, especially in the area of public health and so on. But I don't see that happening very soon, because the lobbies, the big pharma lobbies, are very, very strong, and we find many things happening which are actually quite perverse. I'm not sure whether, I'll just briefly, I can't resist telling you the story, but you know, the San people, the Kalahari Bushmen, discovered that in walking across the desert, there was something in a particular type of cactus which allowed them to deal with both thirst and hunger in walking long distances. Now that item has been isolated by some South Africans, taken and developed in a UK lab, and now sells as a diet pill. Okay, for an extraordinary amount of money. Okay, but the San people get nothing out of it, and they were the ones who first discovered the problem. You know, so you see, it is a very, very perverse and unfair system, and it really has huge implications, unfortunately, and unfortunately I don't see the political conditions being conducive to a short-term solution. But as far as COVID-19 is concerned, two things have happened which are very important. Number one, the WHO has made a commitment to trying to get a free, accessible vaccine for all. And very importantly, President Xi Jinping of China has also made a similar commitment. The problem right now is that there are many companies based in China, they are private companies, and they often have a branch in Hong Kong or abroad, somewhere else abroad, and they are continuing to they have promised, well, they will continue to use those legal devices So Sinopharm, for example, has announced that it will probably charge somewhere in the region of about $140 for the vaccine when they develop it. It is originally a Chinese company, but now it is treated as a transnational company and perhaps probably not subjected to President Xi Jinping's promise. So it'll be very interesting to see how many of these things develop. Likewise, some of the Northern European countries may take a much more enlightened view and insist that, for example, if a Swedish company developed such a pharmaceutical thing, that they might actually buy the right, pay for the patent and make it freely available. But all this remains to be seen. It's very, very unclear, and I'm very glad you raised that question, because that is one of the most troubling features of the modern world and the troubling features of the system in which we live.
I couldn't agree with you more, actually. Yes, very troubling, and it keeps the system and highlights and makes it worse, even where we live in a world where if you have the money, if you have the resources, you can access much better health facilities than if you're poor. And that's not only true of the sort of the rich-poor divide within countries, but also the rich-poor divide between countries around the world as well. So like you pointed out, you know, if you live in America, whether you're rich or poor, you're more likely to receive certain vaccinations or certain medicines than maybe if you're living in Sudan or something like that. So yes, it's an atrocious state of affairs, and yes, very difficult, as you say, to problem to sort out, particularly in the short term, and how even it's sorted out in the long term is a huge debate in itself, for sure.
True.
Okay. Getting back to home, and although maybe I don't look like I'm from Malaysia, I do live in Malaysia. And so home to me is Malaysia, certainly at the moment. There has been rumours that if the COVID figures keep rising, as they have started to this past week in Malaysia, I did hear on the grapevine in the news and on social media that if we have 2 weeks of increase in Malaysia, then the government say that they want to reintroduce the MCO as it was before, which means we'll all be confined back to our homes again. Firstly, do you think that there is a possibility? Secondly, if that is going to happen again, would you recommend any preparations that we should take as individuals to, again, help us through that? You know, should we start panic buying? Is there any, you know, do we get water in? Do we get food in? Do we get dry goods or all that kind of thing? And secondly to that, what can we do just to sort of try, we got 2 weeks to get that figure back down again? Apart from the measures that have already been suggested, what else can we do?
Well, I think there are many things to be done. Let me begin first with the government. I think right now we need to involve all of government much more effectively. I know it's much more difficult for the government today because of its reduced influence, particularly through the media and so on. But there has to be more use of the media, but in modern creative ways, not simply by publishing, by broadcasting, for instance, a simple announcement, you know, don't do this, don't do that, but trying to educate people as to what the risks involved are. Part of the disruption in India, India handled it very badly. And part of the reason was they announced the lockdown, very draconian lockdown, with about 4 hours to go. So many poor people actually started walking home, and they were often walking for a day or two, and if they were caught by the police, they were beaten up, and all kinds of terrible things occurred. But now that there is the possibility of anticipating a second lockdown, I think it is extremely important that we begin to do so in an orderly fashion. That we begin to think about, for example, how we can ensure that food supplies are better organized and can continue to be well organized during a second stay in shelter lockdown. My own view has been that a stay in shelter lockdown is very, very economically disruptive, and we should take a lot of more public health and other measures to try to avoid a second stay in shelter lockdown. And part of the reason has been the complacency which has unfortunately set in the recent period. So the levels of testing, for example, are much, much lower than the government capacity suggests. And it's all well and good to announce that foreigners are responsible for many of the new infections and so on and so forth. It doesn't make one bit of difference to suggest that the infection is foreign in origin. The fact of the matter is that there are perhaps as many as 7 million people in Malaysia who are of foreign origin, and many of them may be infected, but especially, I'm not thinking of people like you who come in as expatriates, but for the poor people who come in and work, you have a huge problem. You have a huge problem where they have, unfortunately, in the last half year or more, been demonized. Demonized in many different ways, and this unfortunately is causing a huge number of problems, and driven them further underground. In Singapore, even where foreign workers are legal, are all documented, they were reluctant to be tested because they were afraid of being expelled. Here we have not only threatening them in various different ways. We are threatening to test them, and the cost of tests are almost half a monthly income for those who have work. Many of them don't even have proper work anymore, proper incomes anymore. And then on the other hand, you have the plantation industry complaining that they don't have enough workers, wanting to use prison labor to harvest the fruits in oil palm plantations. So you have this very, very contradictory situation which needs to be resolved, and you need to involve the human resources and so on. Part of the reason why Korea was so effective was precisely because they really had an all-of-government approach. Public transportation was reconfigured, reorganized very, very quickly. And right now you have a virtual encouragement of private travel. So you have less incomes, but you're going to spend more on transportation. Children, especially children of poorer parents who could not afford devices, were basically classes were being held or were being broadcast and so on and so forth. Many of them had very, very poor educations, and we are already getting a great deal of concern being expressed. Gordon Brown and others are all involved in international education. And we are really talking very seriously about a possible lost generation, of a generation of children who are going to have their education seriously disrupted. So there has to be very, very serious thinking about how we reorganize education. And these things do not have to wait until you announce a lockdown. you need to you need a certain degree of preparedness. Needs to be done right from the word go, and I think beginning to recognize that we cannot even think seriously about a new normal, and we should stop, imagining that all our problems are going to be solved with the availability of a vaccine. We need to begin to recognize that we have to cope with the new circumstances, and this affects all of society. It affects the entire economy in very, very fundamental ways. So I would strongly urge a high degree of recognition of the problems which we are facing, about the need for much better testing than is currently the case, and to stop demonizing the foreign labor in this country, and a whole range of other reforms which are sorely needed if we are going to cope much better. And I think here, we should, instead of looking to the West, we really need to look at East Asia. We need to look at Japan. We need to look at Korea. We need to look at Taiwan. We need to look at China. We need to look at Vietnam, even Laos and Kerala, for beginning to recognize new ways and means for coping with the threat of contagion. Over to you, Andy.
Yes, thank you. Again, I agree entirely with what you're saying there. Just to let everybody know, we've got 9 minutes left before we're due to finish. So you still have a chance to ask a question if you want. In the meantime, I've got at least one more for you. In relation to demonization, the lost generation, and the other difficulties that people face, apart from the economic difficulties that we are all facing. There is great talk, certainly in the UK, not so much in Malaysia, but I'm sure there is a lot of talk of people, not just young people who are missing school and so on, but older generations who are having to isolate themselves, and others that have been suffering a lot of mental health challenges. So our mental health has been suffering, and I just want to know if you've got any comments around that, and if you have suggestions of how people in, I won't say our new normal, but our new circumstances can help revitalize or improve our health, our mental health in these conditions.
Yes, that's again a very important question for a variety of reasons in Malaysia. For a long time, we have not dealt well with mental health. There is a certain tendency, fairly widespread in society, to consider mental health sort of some kind of perversion, and there is very little serious addressing of mental health issues. And it's not just my generation, but I find that younger generations refer to the two major mental health facilities in Tanjung Rambutan and Tampoi with some degree of duration, and that doesn't help. Even in social company, it is very widespread for people to make remarks which do not necessarily help. I think the big challenge really for us is to begin to recognize not only the problems of mental health, of stress, of a whole variety of related phenomena, and and over the human life cycle, that it is normal for people to have to cope with stress. The nature of stress has changed very, very significantly with urbanization, with the new pressures of contemporary life, and with the special challenges of COVID-19 and the continuing, and how this has all evolved. We need that, but unfortunately, there's a tendency to avoid addressing this. There has been a healthy tendency in recent years to recognize, for example, a variety of problems relating to autism, but that again, and to recognize that autism is not a black and white binary situation, but there are a range of conditions and so on and so forth. So there has been a little bit of progress, but not widespread enough. And we need to be able to have people speak about mental health issues much more. And this is not only true of this country. You mentioned the UK, but I would emphasize that, for example, that in the US, this has been a huge problem. It has been a huge problem, and the increasing use of opioids, for example, is related to this, and a whole range of other substances which are hugely problematic for contemporary populations. And in Malaysia too, the problems of illicit drug use are very, very widespread. And so there is, because of the emphasis on drug trafficking and so on and so forth, there has not been a recognition that there's a great deal of manufacture of yaba and a whole range of other narcotic drugs which have been used very often to deal with new mental health challenges. So there is an urgent need for the normalization, if you will, for a much more candid appreciation of the range of mental health issues. Just writing everybody off who's slightly forgetful as demented and the case of Alzheimer's and so on and so forth is not terribly helpful. But unfortunately, that is going to require a rapid course for all of society, including the politicians, about the range of challenges involved, and about the range of unfortunate and very often problematic solutions which individuals have taken on upon themselves. There's a whole range of drug users which we hardly ever admit to in polite society, and this needs to be addressed much more. There's an economist at Princeton, Ann Case, did some very important work, basically on how the United States, a whole range of problems have emerged in the United States, but there has never been, to my knowledge at least, never been anything comparable in most other societies. Perhaps in some of the Northern European societies, there is some work, and I know that there is a lot of work in the UK and even in France and so on. But the need to deal much more with developing country issues is very much overdue. Long ago, there was a psychiatrist from Martinique who wrote about mental health issues in dealing with racism and so on and so forth in a very famous book called Black Skins, White Masks, and so on and so forth. But that whole attempt to try to deal with these problems both medically as well as socially have not really progressed very much in the last half century or more.
Thank you. We are almost at the end of the session. We do have one question in the chat box which I'd like to ask you, and you've got sort of a couple of minutes, or as long as you want really, to answer the question, and then we'll end the session. So this is from Voon Chern Han. Thank you. And they ask, hi, I would like to ask, how will this pandemic change the lives of the people in the future?
Well, I think you're better off asking an astrologer for an answer to that. I'm really not very good at futurology. I think there are so many uncertainties about how things will develop that I would not hazard to a serious predictive reply. But I think some of the things to consider is that, at least, for example, as an economist myself, I do not think that there will be an easy reversion to the economy as we knew it. There are a whole number of areas of where there will be significantly reduced activity. For example, in the area of tourism, and in a whole range of other areas, there are going to be significantly reduced activity. There have been some companies which have done very well out of the crisis. Everybody knows about how well the latex gloves companies have been doing. And I'm sure some of those others which have been involved in producing PPE and so on, personal protective equipment and so on. But I think more seriously, I think what we see is a much more traditional, if you will, concern with where food comes from. And this is a very important time to reset food supplies. One of the big problems in Malaysia, for example, is that we are not very concerned about food safety. You know, food can be produced under unsafe conditions. So what we use a lot of toxic herbicides to produce vegetables and other plant-based foods, and there is very little attention being paid to that. We only get some attention to it when our Malaysian vegetables are stopped at the causeway and cannot be allowed to enter Singapore. Otherwise, we don't really seem to care about what happens to the excessive use of antibiotics. I think there was a UK government report a few years ago, which raised the likelihood of, which highlighted that probably at least 10 million people will die, and many more people will have diminished lives because of the excessive use of antibiotics in animal breeding, whether it's fish or chicken or poultry or other animals. And then we have so we need to begin to rethink many of these issues. We need to begin to think about reducing our animal source foods. I'm no vegan, but I think we need to recognize, for example, that bovine animals use a great deal of methane gas, and methane gas is hugely problematic. And so we and also it's not wonderful for human health. You know, and so we need to begin to rethink food. We need to begin to think lifestyles. The fact that we are undoubtedly in the equatorial zone, but we need to begin to think about how architecture and building that we live in much cooler conditions. Those of us living in the Klang Valley are stuck in a heat trap. And we need to begin to think about how we can reduce our reliance on fossil fuels for cooling systems and so on and so forth. And we need to think about what is going to happen now that many supply chains are being disrupted, not only because of COVID-19, but also because of the political responses. Both the United States government as well as the Japanese government have said that they are going to ask their companies in China to withdraw from China. But we in Malaysia produce a lot of products which are intermediate for goods which eventually come out of China, come through China. So we are going to be very, very adversely affected by that. So we need to begin to think about new ways of reorganizing the economy proactively rather than simply reactively to circumstances as they change. And this opportunity for us to begin to think about quality of life issues and so on. And in the area of higher education, this offers us a huge opportunity to begin to think about relevance, about the importance of the human, about the importance of what constitutes a good life, besides material acquisitions and so on and so forth. So there are a whole range of issues which need to be opened up. I'm afraid I cannot answer the question Boon raised, but I do think it is a very important question to ask and to keep asking as we begin to think about our futures. And there will not be a single future, obviously, but obviously we all come together in different ways and need to begin to think about this. And this should be a deliberative process. It should not be accidental. It should not be left to the masters of the universe, so to speak, the big five, so on and so forth. And we need to engage much more in increasingly public conversations. And I'm very glad that Boon raised the question for us to ponder. And thank you once again to Help University and to you, Andy, for this very interesting and thought-provoking session, at least for me. I'm not sure whether anybody else.
Well, big thanks goes to you, Prof JOMO. Really appreciate you coming along. You've said, yes, lots and lots of food for thought. I see a future of bubbles, not only physically but metaphorically, of us finding our own metaphorical bubbles to live in and our bubbles with other people. And, you know, who's to know, maybe we will all form physical bubbles that we live in and start bouncing off each other. That would be one future. That could be fun. But anyway, it's been lovely to talk to you. I do hope that you're able to come again. I look forward to the response from people. Please do check the link in the chat box to give us some feedback. And for now, Prof JOMO, big thanks and wishing you all the very best. And on behalf of all our audience, I'd like to say goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'd like to share the responses. Please share the responses with me as well. I'd like to see feedback, including critical feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.